Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Florida Interest Network presentation of domestic violence understandings in a time of COVID. Before I turn things over to our speaker, Ron Osborne, I'd like to introduce myself as chair of the Florida Interest Network. My fellow board member, Dr. Irma Barron, is with us today, and several other participants. So if you are seeing this recording in YouTube, if you will look below for some information regarding how to obtain your CEUs, basically what you want to do is go to either email Dr. Barlow at his address that will be listed below here, or you can register through Florida FFTA, and we'll provide that link as well. When you pay through Florida FTA, you'll just pay through PayPal, and with Dr. Barlow, he will send you a Square invoice so that you can put in your credit card and all that, and we never have to see any of that information, so it's all kept completely secure. Your CEUs for this workshop are 2, and if you are a student of MFT or mental health counseling or social work, this 2-credit workshop will count towards your licensure. And of course, for those of you who are licensees, this will count for your renewal. Dr. Barlow, anything that need to be added on the housekeeping end of things?
Yeah, if you do the website address, the floridafta.com, and go to courses, then that's PayPal. If you email me, it's Square. So I'll send you a Square invoice. So it's one or the other.
Right, not both. Not both. I mean, if you want to give a donation, but no, it doesn't have to be both.
Right.
So I'm very pleased to introduce Ron Osborne. Ron and I have known each other for quite some time, and even before I really knew him, he was a presenter on domestic violence. But what always happened in the scheduling is he would be presenting on domestic violence when I was presenting on HIV. So I never got to see his presentation, even though we've engaged him as part of FAMFT and now Finn for years. I mean, many, many, many years. So I am delighted to finally be able to see his presentation. Ron is currently a doctoral student at Nova Southeastern, soon to be Dr. Osborne. Can't wait to call you that, Ron. And I will turn it over to you to tell us how you came to know about domestic violence.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Well, I've been doing this domestic violence thing for so long. A lot of people ask me, well, how did you get into doing domestic violence? How did you become, at some point in Broward County, I was the domestic violence guru? And how did that happen? It happened because I had always had an interest in domestic violence as being a secondary victim, and from childhood. So I once lived in the domestic violence shelter in Jacksonville, Florida, Hubbard House. And from that experience, you get to really understand the dynamics of being a male who can understand how domestic violence affects a family, and how that it doesn't mean that the cycle has to continue, that you can then become the advocate for the change that you hope that would happen. And so later on in life, when I was in Nova, there was opportunity. Everybody has to do the student teaching. I went to, looked around, and Women in Distress had the best schedule because I was a full-time teacher, and they didn't really do things during the day. They did all their therapy in the evening. So I went and became a therapist there, doing my internship. I ended up graduating in 2010, and I stayed at Women in Distress for about a year and volunteered to get to know the whole agency. So I learned that, like, not just the therapy department, I did everything. I did any kind of groups that they didn't have somebody to facilitate, and that was always very interesting. And can you imagine women coming into an empowerment group and seeing a male as the empowerment facilitator? and then I left and went away. And then I came back to work on my doctor's degree here at Nova, and I ended up becoming a education and prevention specialist. That in that program we did nothing but educate and prevention throughout all of North Miami-Dade, all of Broward, and Southern Palm Beach County. So we did, I don't know, I can't even imagine how many trainings about domestic violence, teen dating violence, you name it, working, doing advocacy in the school. So I've been doing this training and trainings like these for a while. And a lot of people like me to come because I give a very different approach. If you know anything about domestic violence, a lot of domestic violence has a lot of advocates. And so advocates have a certain viewpoint about presenting domestic violence compared to us who are clinicians, and we look at it in maybe in another and more of a system base. And that was one of the things I think when my time at Women in Distress, there was a conflict. You had advocates, you had therapists who had the expertise on what domestic violence and how it should be taken care of. And so I learned that, and I took all of that and brought it into the presentations that I'm going to kind of do for you today. So this presentation is revised. So some things we won't get to see. We won't get to see the videos because videos are too hard to see on Zoom. I mean, I'm doing it. I teach a class at Broward College, so I have to sometimes have my phone in the video that I want to show them. And if you can imagine the college students there, they're not, I don't know if they're sometimes even paying attention, but I know you guys will be paying attention because this is something you're interested in. So let me open the screen. Okay, and everybody see?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good thing.
Yes.
All right, so this is understanding the impacts of COVID-19 on domestic violence training. We're going to discuss some of the learning. Well, let me say this. I'm going to ask, this won't be a lecture. I'm not very good at lecturing. I'm very good at facilitating groups. So I'm going to ask that many times that you guys participate and please, so it doesn't have to be me reading everything. Let you read some of the key points. So I ask for volunteers to read throughout the time, and some interaction things that we will be doing. But these are the learning objectives for today's training. We're going to be looking at some of the effects of domestic violence and intimate partner violence to understand on the whole family during COVID-19, recognize some of the effects of power and control on the community for all members of society, identify some of the power and social influences on children and adolescents exposed to domestic violence and intimate partner violence, identify and understand the risk levels and reactions of domestic violence and intimate partner violence on the whole family during COVID-19. This is a very tense time where domestic violence can be very heightened, but not being able to be recognized, and then increase the capability of providing referrals for victims by knowing the resources provided locally. So if you are living in this area, I'm going to give you a nice overview of who and where all the locations that you can help victims or even your clients to inform. All right, so I'm going to ask for some first volunteer to read this example of, please.
This is Anna Lynn, and I'll be happy to read. A case manager mentioned that the abuser was using the virus as a scare tactic to keep the survivor away from their kids.
So this is a classic example of power and control being used, but you won't see it as that because here in an example like this, the other parent may say, hey, the virus is dangerous, the kids is dangerous, so I'm not gonna let you see the kids. I'm gonna keep the kids away until the virus clears up. And when is that? And when does that happen? And that becomes a control technique that can cause a problem for families. All right, here's another example. Rita?
Anna
Health,
Marie,
go ahead.
a health professional still living with their abuser called and said they were physically abused that night because their abuser was sure they were trying to infect them with COVID-19.
So now you have the excuse of COVID-19 being the reason for abusive behavior or that, as if, you know, it wasn't like the person not working in the healthcare profession, and I'm sure they take all the precautions that they need to take, but this gives this the ability for abuser to justify the abuse that they are causing on another. All right, and one last one.
I can read. The advocate said the abuser was using COVID-19 as a scare tactic so that they would not visit family.
And this is a technique they usually call, and we know and recognize, as isolation. So now you use the COVID-19 as a reason for the person not to visit or see any other people, taking complete control over their whole entire life. And it seems very extreme, but a lot of these things are done in a very covert way, that it seems that I'm doing something because I'm concerned. And in this case, I'm concerned about you not seeing any of your family because, you know, you may get COVID-19, you may give it to us, you may give it to children, so let's just stay away. Let's not be involved with anybody else. And that seems at some point to be justified, but it's done as a control tactic because they don't want them to be around anybody else but themselves. And you find that when you hear these experiences. All right, so this is a video that we're not going to be able to see, but if you get an opportunity, you can always go to YouTube. It is No More, Domestic Violence and COVID-19. This is a quick PSA. That's an opportunity. All right, so here's the part where we're going to engage in a true and false, but what's going to happen is I'm going to find out how many people believe it's true. So if on your, you have, I know on here you have a thumbs up or a hand. Do you have, we have this on here? Can people see if they can put that up? Okay, thumbs up will be true, and you have the hands on the other, and put the, yeah, and hands will be false. So we would do thumbs up, and so I'll get to see who's believing this comment is true, and then if someone is a solo person who believes something is true or false, I'll let you explain why you believe this, and then we can talk and discuss it. All right. All right, so the first one is power and control tactics are very common in our society. True or false?
I don't see.
Okay, so looks like everybody. Anybody false? No falses? Okay, no falses. So this is true. We see, listen, not just in domestic violence situations or intimate partner violence, we see power and control tactics being carried on all forms of our society. And sometimes even in some of social unrest that we see now, some of the concern is that is based on power and control. But sometimes when we're looking at this and we're thinking of people that are connected intimately, it has a more profound effect because if you're at the school and people are doing something in power control to you, you can decide to leave that school and nothing happen because you might lose your money for the tuition or something of that nature. But a lot of times when you're in this intimate partner relationship, it's much harder to leave that relationship and move on because you are intertwined, not just financially or physically, but very much emotionally. So these are some things that you look at. Power control tactics are very common in our society. So if they're very common in society, you can imagine how common they could be involved in relationships. All right, domestic violence occurs only in poor, uneducated, and minority families. True or false? Okay, looks like the majority of people are saying false. Okay, false. And that is false. It doesn't matter, It does not matter. It does not matter at all what a person's socioeconomic status is, what their education is. We have found, and you find, that domestic violence affects anyone who's in a relationship. They can have a PhD or they can have a GED. They can be a CEO. They can be the facilities person that comes and cleans up at night. It doesn't matter. It's all about being in relationships and how the power and control in that relationship is developed. All right, the real problem is couples who assault each other. Women are just as violent as men. The real problem is couples who assault each other. The real problem is women are just as violent as men. Okay, I see a couple. Okay, I see some different. All right, so let me go back again. Let me see those hands up in negatives and positives. I seen a hand up. Let me see that person had that thumb. True. Okay, let me hear from you, Dr. Emma. Why do you say it's true?
Because I have students that are placed at community agencies and they work with male survivors of domestic violence. And especially in Miami, there's a lot of power and control when these men are helpless in the sense that they need their papers, the documentation, they might not be documented. And so they are victimized with violence from female partners as well as male partners as well in same-sex relationships. And those are the ones that go the most underreported.
Right. So anybody else want to dispute on the other end why they picked false?
Yeah, I'll mention something there.
Go ahead, Larry.
I know that I know it happens. You know, like Lee Harvey Oswald was physically abused and emotionally abused by his partner. So I know it happens. I objected as just as violent as men. That was the part that I took into question there.
Okay. All right. So this is false. And Dr. Armour, you're absolutely correct, because the research does say that there is the equal tendency of women to be violent, the research in this for this question. But what comes back to it is that on the percentage wise, more men have the tendency to be more violent than women and act on more violence. But then we also understand that some of that is based on also our gender roles and the idea of how we feel and identify aggression. And a question like this is really for that kind of discussion to understand that this is a true fact, and many people don't know that. I taught that class you're talking about. I taught that class of Women in Distress, where it was not even in myself, we didn't leave those meetings without tissue being handed around with a group of men, because of some of the things that you could not imagine that somebody would do to somebody who's supposed to be their husband. And it was not based on a physical touch or doing, but you was going to send them back to Jamaica. You was going to send them back to Guatemala. You was going to send them back if they didn't sleep in the garage and give you the check and get up and work it. You know, these things, and people say, nah, I would never do that. But you haven't, you know, we don't recognize unless we've been in those situations and have really heard those stories. So I do agree 100%. It's seen that, but it is overall is found that men are usually the more aggressor, and it shows statistic wise, men are more announced to do domestic violence or be violent,
And
more violent than women.
question, Ron.
Yes.
When you say that men are statistically more violent than women, are you saying as far as physical violence, or is that violence across the board?
Absolutely. It is very important to and we're going to talk a little bit about that later, in understanding that physical violence is the one that is most identified, because many men do express their feelings physically, So it's noted that men seem to be more, when we say domestic violence is someone physically touching somebody, then the statistic will show in a higher propensity that there will be men who show up as the higher perpetrator of domestic violence.
Right.
But if we go and look at the other dynamics of intimate partner violence, domestic violence, like threats or verbal emotional abuse, that may not be the same number, and also that goes unreported a lot of times.
Right.
So someone could be physically and mentally abused for their whole life and never report it, and no one ever know that happens to them.
Right.
So the violence does come out, and it shows out in men more. So that is some bias in the research as well.
Right. Thank you.
All right. Domestic violence is rarely a one-time occurrence. True or false? That's true. It is true. It is rarely a one-time occurrence. If someone is, and this is the old thing, oh, I'll never do it again. If a person does something one time, as we know about patterns occur. And a lot of times, by the time that someone gets to actually physically touching somebody in domestic violence or intimate partner relationships, they have already did all the other controlling factors that may have seemed not to work. And we're gonna go deeper into that when we get into some more of the presentation. All right, a partner has a right to discipline their partner for misbehaving. A partner has a right to discipline their partner for misbehaving. Okay, so I see all down, see all the downs. Okay, and that's an easy one. No partner has a right to discipline their partner for misbehaving. There is, but when we do look at, one of the things that we do find is that culturally, when you look at some cultures, even when they bring their culture into America, the whole family, everyone follows a track like this. And so because everyone feels it's okay, and as a cultural thing, it becomes problematic if we as professionals even have something to say. I remember one time speaking to a colleague saying that, they were dealing with a family that was from an Indian family, from East India, and they didn't know how to handle that. The wife thought it was okay for the husband to discipline her, and not just the husband, but anybody else in the family could discipline her. And so she didn't see that as domestic violence, because that was the cycle of what was supposed to be done. And that is a very hard, because the therapist was saying, I don't know how to handle this, because am I being too biased with my cultural view to interfere on their culture? And I was saying, well, when in Rome, sometimes you got to do what Romans do. We don't have a culture where we want people to be abused and beat on. So that is a comfortable thing in a culture where they might have to go back. And you also say how you don't feel, as a therapist, you may want to say that she doesn't, that's not what that no one deserves that. Not that's what you feel, but no one deserves for that to happen to them. Because it's all key, and we're going to talk about all key of what you say when people tell you these things. Battered persons are masculinistic and provoke the abuse. They must like it or they would leave. All right, look like thumb down. That's correct. No one wants, it's not that the person likes to be abused. There are a lot of factors that cause people not to be able to leave the abuse. Matter of fact, the number one is fear and safety. You don't know what the person being battered has been told by the batterer. And so the idea of you suggesting that they leave, why don't you leave, why didn't you leave, are terms that actually, that we call victim blaming, puts that person in a deeper hole, because they realize they don't even have you to be able to talk to in some instances. All right, person who batters are often good parents and should have joint custody of their children if the couple separate. This is all. Listen, people see me and know my business that I work in, and they say, hey, this is a tricky question you're asking. But I see hands down, and hands down is correct. I am an advocate for fathers' rights, but not a father who is abusive, because there is statistics that show the same father that will be abusive to a mother will ultimately turn around and when if the mother is not there, will implement that violence onto their child, because this issue is about power and control. And a lot of times kids are more culpable to be controlled because they're children. They are dependent upon parents. But then you see the abuse accelerate because the kid is so agreeing to follow what parents say. So this is true. All right, so as we can see, there are many people who are affected by domestic violence. But one of these things about the statistics I'm going to show you right now points out this idea that many of the statistics we see are probably doubled based on the non-reports or reports that don't involve physical violence. So we look at the first one: 43 million women and 38 million men experience psychological aggression by an intimate partner in their lifetime. That's a large number. But then again, this statistic only based on the numbers of people who actually ever told somebody, or let me tell you something that even recognized that they were in a intimate partner or emotional distress relationship. They may not even recognize or identify it as so. 1 in 4 women experience intimate partner violence during their lifetime. 1 out of 10 men experience intimate partner in their lifetime. Now let me go back, because these statistics right here, right, have changed. They change a lot. There was just a couple years ago, this was the statistic for men. 1 in 4, and for the women it was 1 in 3. And as you can see, it has kind of become larger. And I want to say so much about this because before, and I don't know how many of you guys can remember this situation. This was recently, in the last 10 to 15 years, that there was a domestic violence incident that became worldwide. Anybody remember that incident?
Was that the football player who hit his wife in the elevator on
Absolutely.
video? Okay.
It was the Ray Rice incident. And the Ray Rice incident did something that when most people talk about it, and that's why you gave that timeline. Most time I talk about, people think about O.J. Simpson, they say that O.J. Simpson, and then that's when they seen change happen in O.J. Simpson. And it was true because it was a highly populated. But when Ray Rice occurred, before that, the statistics wasn't very known. But if you remember that time, domestic violence was on the cover of every newspaper, magazine, cable network for almost about 3 months. And because it was a great, I remember us when we were in the domestic violence culture, we were saying, oh, this is a great idea, but what's going to come of it? Because people are becoming aware and they're going to make movements and they're going to do things, but will it really change? And probably more because this was really affecting the NFL. And the NFL was the key that everyone was looking at. And that's when you see numbers really change down to that numbers I was telling you, the 1 in 3, the 1 in 4, because of exposure. And then you look now, these numbers have been now spread back out so far. And this is a good example of showing how trends operate, that if we don't keep the message and the information out for people to be aware of, what ends up happening is people begin to forget and let it go back to the way things were. And that's an important factor that, we don't think about a lot. We think, well, okay, we took care of a situation, but the situation sometimes doesn't get taken care of. It just fades back into the next news cycle. And we still have people suffering from the same intimate partner and domestic violence incidents. So Same for, but what has also helped us, I would say, in our understanding domestic violence a little bit more and ungenderizing it. I don't even know if that's a word, but I like to make up some fancy words, but move the gender away from the violence. Um, 1 in 4 same-sex partners experience intimate partner violence. When we put this into play and understanding the number of same-sex partners that are having it, it moves the idea that domestic violence is a male aggressive to female issue. It shows that this is more of a relationship issue, and whoever has the power in the relationship utilizes that in that power to control the relationship. And there's no better way to show that than in same-sex couples, whereas the people may be of the equal size, equal height, equal, you know, the equality of body mass is the same in many cases. I remember I was at the after conference, and one of the speakers was talking about, you know, dealing with same-sex partners in domestic violence. And he said that, you know, he was sitting in his lobby and he seen a very big 6'3" muscle guy come in, and the partner, it was a small petite, about 5'2", and then he knew that there was some signs, he didn't know who, but there was some domestic issues, and he just automatically, his brain turned to that the situation was the bigger partner. And when he had the session, he said he was sadly mistaken. It wasn't the bigger partner. So it wasn't about the size, it was about who has the control on the other person. And so the 5'2" person was the one who was abusive and controlling in those aspects. So it is a good, this is a good place to be able to break down to people the stereotype of domestic violence, to also help us push our cause that it affects everybody, because when it affects everybody, more people are willing to help change it. If it doesn't affect me, I don't have nothing to do with it. It's okay. The other part that we look at is that 15% of all violent crimes account for domestic violence. When you see a violent crime that happens in the media where the man killed this woman or 2 people shot, they tell us that, but they don't go back to the root of the story. And a lot of times you find a large majority of stories are based on some domestic issue that occurred that spilled out into the bigger society. 1 in 6 homicide victims are killed by intimate partner violence. That could either be either way. That could be, and this is the part that's important that a lot of people don't think. If you was to track the number of women who are in prison for killing their partners, life, most of them have life, you would find that a large majority of them have an experience of being domestically abused, and most of the time it was based on the idea of self-defense. And one of the travesties that we have in our justice system is that the same court system that did not do anything for that woman when she was being abused uses her abuse as the reason to prosecute her for life in prison. She wanted revenge, so she waited for the moment that all the breath was coming out of her, and then she stabbed him in the neck. No, that's not how the story probably went, but it makes for a good prosecution. But you know, the argument is what happened before this, and how many times was, you know, were there restraining orders taken out. And so a lot of things, you know, this is something that we don't really think about. We just hear about the victims that's happening, but some of the victims are males, but they're males who are caused from their domestic abuse, and victims really defending themselves to stay alive, as I would say. That doesn't discount there's some people who calculate to kill their husbands or wife, and usually that's over money, not over power and control and domestic violence we see sometimes. If you watch enough ID channel, you'll see that. So domestic violence, as we can see, crosses all boundaries: culture, age, race, sex, education, socioeconomic status. It can affect everybody. There's no one who can't be affected unless they decide to not be involved in a relationship. And that's an important factor for us to all understand. And we may be affected in different ways that we don't even know. So let's talk a little bit about some of the dynamics of domestic violence. And so one of the biggest points, so when we're looking at domestic violence, is how is domestic violence determined? What is the term? What's the definition? How do we define it? Well, what only really matters in our society is the statute for domestic violence. That is, this is the statute, and this is where most of the things that occur are based on this statute. Here's the tricky part. This says any assault, aggravated battery, sexual assault, stalking, kidnapping, false imprisonment, or criminal offense resulting in an injury or death of one family or household member by another family household member. There's a flaw here in this this statute. Can anybody really point out where that comes when we think about domestic violence?
It doesn't take into account all those other power and control activities that lead up to injury or death.
That's absolutely one of them. The other part is they slight the idea of couples by saying family and household members. Who are family and household members? Oh, uncle, nephew, mom, dad, sister, brother. And I've done tons of batteries. If I do some work for a guy who does domestic battery classes, and I do a lot of his assessments. I have to now sometimes ask the people before they come in what type of restraining order or what type of battery situation are they in, because not everyone is involved in the traditional idea of a man battering a woman. Sometimes it's mothers, they're in trouble for battering boyfriends, girlfriend. So it's all around. So this is one of the stipulations that we're not, that I think that in this definition doesn't help. It gives us a clear example of what is going on, but it also makes it difficult for real services to be rendered to the people that is affected by it. You know, because in the case of me and my brother getting into a domestic dispute, I can make the decision to say, I'm not gonna live in the house no more, I'm out of here. Me, our roommate, I'm gonna leave. But when you're talking about when we move to the idea of them being intimate partners, that's completely different. I'm gonna talk about it when I get to right there. But I just wanted to show them, I talked about this before, and when we're talking in the true and false about the real scope that from the legal point of view, what the police how the police affect domestic violence compared to what's left. On this continuum, this is the continuum of abuse that occurs. But what happens is we only really ever see any intervention when it's a physical abuse. That's why our knowledge of what domestic violence is based so much on the physical, because that's the only thing that we really are, that is documented, are shown, are previewed. Sometimes people are not even thinking about the others actions on the continuum, such as threats of violence, verbal, emotional abuse. Whereas if you weighed it out, and I remember this so clear in my mind, the idea that, hey, if you get an injury, guess what happens? You're going to go in the hospital, and your injury is going to heal. But when you're verbally, emotionally abused, what do you get? Nothing. You don't get anything for it. It stays. And that's the great thing I think about most domestic violence centers. They continue to offer therapeutic services to people who have experienced domestic violence, no matter when it was. And that's a really important part, that because you see how important it is. And as a clinician who worked with that population, you see how important where someone was dealing with domestic violence 20 years ago, and everything they're doing in their life is affected by what happened 20 years ago, and they have not identified that that's how their life is going right now, until they came into that therapy room and was able to talk about, well, why are these things happening? Oh, I dealt with the domestic violence, it's over. But it wasn't really over. Where was the healing that you got the Band-Aid, you got your, when you went to the hospital, you got a Band-Aid, you got stitches, you got a cast. When did you get that for your spirit, for your soul, for your mental health? A lot of times the people don't get it. And so hopefully we suggest people look into that very often. So in other comparison of intimate partner violence, intimate partner violence does a far better job of helping us understand how people can end up in these relationships, and that they don't have to fit into the traditional means of a male-woman relationship, and that is a male perpetrator on a female. you're able to see that intimate partner violence talks about the broader terms of domestic violence and identifies dating violence, because if people are involved with domestic violence in a dating violence scenario, the first thing the police will say is, you live here? You live here? Oh, you don't live here? Go to your house and this is over. Don't come back. Now, that sounds very easy to do, but not if a person is already intimately involved, emotionally involved with somebody. They might not be living in the same house, but they already have intertwined themselves into this relationship. So what you begin to see is that these patterns of abusive behavior through the use of power and control tactics used by one person over another person in an intimate relationship. These power control tactics only work because the individuals are in these intimate relationships. When people first get involved with somebody, they share all their vulnerability. Well, they shouldn't, but a lot of times they share all their vulnerabilities, all their weaknesses, all the mistakes. And if that person is not, equal, a person may be a manipulator, they may be somebody who wants to be controlling. And I even say this, a lot of times domestic abusers don't even know what they're doing is wrong. This is the part that a lot of people forget, because it's a learned behavior. It's not something they said, I'm going to get up in the morning and become an abuser. They seen this behavior, it worked for whoever they were around, and they continue that same behavior. That's why I think that, it doesn't happen here in the state of Florida, because the Florida Coalition is completely against being involved with any abusers. I think that is a major failure of the change of this, but I'm just one guy who just works with people in this. But if we could begin to deal with the cycles for both couples, both people in the relationship, we can resolve some of the issues. If someone does something wrong to you and they never apologize or never admit to why they do it, you don't get closure to that. And if you only punish me for doing something and don't hold me accountable for what I did, I don't think I was wrong. You just don't like me. What I was doing was right. You just don't like me. I have no excuse to tell you, yes, this is what I learned to do when I was a kid, so I thought this was the right thing to do, and this is how I think relationships go. That doesn't really happen, because you isolate and say go separate ways, and sometimes that's not good, especially when kids are involved. But we understand it being this learned behavior, that how intimate partner violence is the learned behavior. It is a stimulus that you make that normally a child will see and begin to understand. They begin to emotionalize it in the brain. It filters on how, this is how things operate, this is how it works, and they interpret it, and it comes from a behavior. So it's, I love to use the scenario of many kids who are in a domestic violence household, and they see that on Monday through Thursday, mom and dad are lovey-dovey, eating it. It's a family structure. By Friday, dad goes out, they fight Friday night, they fight Saturday night, and then Sunday go to church, and then everything is back together on Monday. So if that kid sees that kind of behavior, what do they interpret? Well, that's okay to do in a relationship, to fight on Friday and Saturday, and then Sunday, everything's okay and we start our regular work week. Never really understanding that why the family's mother and father fought, why did they come back together? Because I think we don't really treasure our kids to think that their frontal lobe is working that well. But it is, we just don't know it. This is a video also, See Children Do. This is a video just showing parents walking around and the kids doing identical things that they do. It's one of my favorite videos. I've been using it for years. So you see exactly that children, what they see, they do. And if you do something different, they will do it too. So. All right, so then this goes into the idea of how domestic violence continues, because if children are watching and seeing your behavior and seeing domestic violence, we begin to realize that about 15 million children are exposed to domestic violence. We're talking about just the exposure. 15 million kids are exposed to it each year. And of that 15 million, 90% of those children exposed to domestic violence witnessed the abuse. So they're exposed to the idea of it, and 90% of them are actual witnesses of it. And when they witness it, it becomes a part of them, and that they then have to take on and figure out what they do with it. You begin to start to see these kids and the effects in their behaviors in school and different places, emotional outbursts, and they show aggressiveness, loss of appetite, loss of focus in school, anti-social behavior. Some become withdrawn, some become depressed, nightmares, bedwetting, low self-esteem. But the biggest thing is that a lot of times the educators don't recognize this as for it being effects of domestic violence, because when the parents are called to the school, they say, hey, what's the issue with the kid? They see two eligible parents with no issues, no problems. We don't understand why Johnny is doing this. And Johnny's not going to tell you, because he already knows what the result of expressing that mom does this to dad or dad does this to mom. He's dealing with all of that, or she's dealing with all of that, trying to pressure and what is her role or his role into that. And that's where we see they bring that over into their adulthood and long-term effects. They're becoming adults, still dealing with it. You start to see the adult depression, the post-traumatic stress disorder, to deal and cope, substance use, because that's a really big thing, that both abusers and victim survivors are big substance users. Because the idea of this, that I'm going to use this substance because I feel like something I'm doing is wrong, but I'm going to numb it from it happening, versus this is happening to me, I can't take it, I'm going to take this to numb it from happening to me. You see a lot of times people who have chronic illnesses, high blood pressure, ulcers, things of that nature, because they're holding on to that trauma and haven't acknowledged or did anything else with it. You see people with strokes, you know about suicide, but the biggest factor of this population is that they are 2 times more likely to become either an abuser or a victim. And that goes back to what the heart of everything I always say is, we have to recognize that both the abuser and the victim are the same person. They just took the different paths on how to express what they experienced in their learned behavior. And if we first looked at that, we could then also recognize that we should work with them equally, separately, and together, to let them understand how this came, this, and how they could resolve from it. But it's dangerous. It's also dangerous work, depending on how volatile the abuser can be. So a lot of people don't want to touch it. This is the power control wheel. And if you look at these power control, do you see any? What's the closest thing to someone actually physically doing something to somebody here?
Looks like sexual abuse is the
And
closest.
so and so what happens is, I do when I do a really long presentation, I do a breakdown of using this power wheel, this power control wheel, to describe going into a romantic relationship. And I use these tactics that are power control tactics, and I use them to show how going into a relationship with someone, developing a relationship, could be beautiful, but also on the other end of that could be some of these power control tactics that you don't even recognize. For example, isolation. Telling your partner that, hey, you got a job in Portland. We live in Florida. Let's go move to Portland. Don't worry about getting a job. Don't worry about any of that. I'm going to take care of everything. I have all the money. Let's just come out and let's go to Portland. Here's the ring. We're getting married. And I'm speeding this up some, but that is a perfect example of isolation. Now, this person has took the person away from everybody and everything they know, and they're living in Portland. They don't let them get a job. They tell them, you don't need a job. I got tons of money. Just stay at home. Here, if you need to buy something, here, use this card right here. That's not their own card. It's that person's card. You know, so you see this idea of the economic abuse beginning to occur. Use of children, all of these tactics that you begin to see, and you would not, imagine in the role play that I do, I go through every one of these as a scenario, and we don't get to the actual sexual abuse occurring. And that's the last thing I do in this role play, because it also is the last thing that can occur where I'm going to then start physically abusing that person in this relationship. And remind you is that in every one of these other tactics that I've described, I have won the battle with using these tactics, using the children, using my male privilege to have the priest tell her that she should love her husband and follow what he should do. These are the kind of things I do in the role play, and usually I have one of the participants come, but it really begins to show us that. I mean, even the example I love to use this: the use of children. The use of children is the idea of even having children back to back, saying, "Hey, honey, oh, don't worry about going to school yet. Let's just have our 4 kids now." That puts her in a rough disposition to say, you're looking at least 4 years, 4 to 8 years of not being able to kind of do what you need to do, because if you have 4 kids back to back, it's going to take you almost 8 years to get them ready to be able to be going to school. And you're at the mercy of that partner. And if they decide after the kids are here, I don't want you to work, you're kind of stuck in that disposition because now you have 4 kids. So these are little things that, you know, in the ideal situation, the husband says, hey, let's have the kids. And after you have the kids, I will take off. You can do your thing and I'll work with the kids. That's ideal. What is real would happen. But a lot of times we don't see that happening. Sometimes some manipulation.
Ron, can I can't help but insert at this moment that this particular workshop is happening just 1 week after the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Justice Ruth Bader, the notorious RBG, and that in the 50s and 60s, when she was coming up and could not get a job as an attorney, even though she was top of her class in law school, and that this idea of economic abuse and isolation and the use of male privilege was standard operating procedure in our culture. And it is the laws that she challenged that even began the allowing of women to get a credit card. I can remember when my mother got a credit card for the first time in her own name, and she was probably in her 40s when that happened. And so I just want to point out that the power and control wheel was standard operating, and that we're still combating to this day legally the right for women to control their own bodies, and our current fear that Roe v. Wade is going to be overturned, and how the law about women and gender is intimately tied to these very issues. And tell me if I've spoken out of turn.
No, I think that it is a crucial part of, you know, remembering that the domestic violence movement was formulated out of this actual idea that you're talking about. I mean, I think some people don't even think about that in a context of how we even got to domestic violence, but that is a large part of where we came from. And that's also a part of the difficult sometimes of trying to get everyone back on board and the importance of it, because people are looking at it as sometimes, and that goes into that argument I was saying, advocates versus non-advocates. Because advocates strictly, you know, they kind of always sometimes rub people the wrong way. So they kind of like don't bring people in, they kind of push people away. And I would always say that if you really want to solve this, you have to make it everybody's issue. Like we do with you know, we know that we celebrate breast cancer, right? but breast cancer is a bigger term for cancer for everybody, because everybody can be affected by cancer. So that's a really big thing. And this is what we have to sometimes do when we're doing this. Show that this doesn't just affect the women, it affects everybody. The children who are affected are not just women, they're also men. So it continues on in a cycle. So definitely that point is a valid point in this discussion. All right, some of the power and control tactics that we see things happen: physical violence, sexual violence, verbal, emotional stalking, economic abuse, isolation. We also see the use of children, the use of privilege, threats and coercion, using the idea of minimizing things, denying, blaming. A really big thing right now that, and I'm sure this group audience will remember. I do this in other groups, and they don't really remember these envelopes. When we see blackmail, if you would ever watch Dallas, and JR would have an envelope and would give this envelope to somebody back in the 80s with pictures in there telling them they didn't do this. We don't have that kind of blackmail today. The blackmail is done everything by the phone and anything you do with your partner. So now they're blackmailing their partners with intimate things that they have shared or things they know. You see that also then in electronic threats and coercion, social abuse. This happens a lot where it happens a lot more in school and high school age students, where one partner is with the other, and that person is the popular person, and it can make everybody else stop being their friend because they are the popular person. So people do whatever they want to do and how they want to do it. Yes, that's right. Revenge porn, definitely that was a big case in Davie 4 or 5 years ago, where the two police officers was dating, and they were going to get in trouble. So the male officer wanted her to leave and go to another, and she said, "No, why don't you leave?" And then he threatened to share her stuff. And because here's a valid point, and I say this all the time, because she was a law enforcement person, she knew the law, what she could do. She went to her Coral Springs Police Department, filed a complaint against him, and next thing you know, he was in trouble. But the average person who doesn't know what the end result of that is will say, "Okay, I bow out. I don't want to take that. I can't. I don't want to ruin my career. I don't want to do those things." And then we have digital abuse. People using your social media to do things against you. They know the passwords to your stuff, so they put horrible things on your social media and say, "If you don't want me to do it again, you do what I say do." And these are some, and I know at some point it sounds unreal that someone is doing these things, but you can't only imagine how many people this is really happening to, and it happens. And you say, how would someone let somebody do that? And I realize that you just don't know what disposition people are in until it's too late. All right, so let's look at some of the effects of domestic violence during this COVID-19 time. What we are seeing is that partners may withhold necessity items such as hand sanitizer and disinfectant. Now, somebody said to me, "What? How are they gonna do that?" Well, sometimes if that, you have to remember that our situation that we live is not everybody else's situation. Sometimes there is the main person in the family who has the resources to everything. And if I threaten to say, "I'm not going to give you a hand sanitizer or disinfectant because if you're not doing what I said," that's scary, especially when you see the number of deaths due to COVID. Abusive partners may share misinformation about pandemic to control the frightened survivors or to prevent them from seeking appropriate medical attention if they have symptoms, telling them that they don't have anything wrong. That's not because again, you're talking about people who are in these. A lot of people don't look at people involved with domestic violence situations as typical people walking around every day. But there are a lot of people who are in very severe situations described by these situations where they are completely controlled by the partner, the information that they are given, the food that they are given, the money they are giving, the resource to the world is based on that person. And I'm sure at many point we can talk about this idea people have, and it's going to come up in the next one. If the person has all the documentation, if you have no legal documentation, you need them for your documentation. Whatever they tell you, you say yes to. You don't say no. I'm not, because they can call and say I don't have no documentation for that person, and then that's where you start to see issues. Abused partners may withhold insurance cards, threaten to cancel insurance, prevent survivors from seeking medical attention if needed. You also see programs that serve survivors may be significantly impact. Shelters may be full or may even stop intake at all. Survivors may be fearful entering shelter because it's going to be close quarters, and you know that this is going to go on, so they may not want to go to the shelter. They may just stay in the disposition that they're in. Survivors who are older and have chronic heart or lung conditions may be at a higher increased risk at public places when they would typically get support, like a shelter, counseling center, a courthouse. And imagine when the courthouse was not even open, how was people even filing any restraining orders or anything like that? And you say, oh, they had computers. Not everybody had. I know sometimes what we do, we take a lot of stuff for granted. And you don't really know that until you work at the base level of people in Broward County. Some people don't have a phone. They don't have a smartphone. They have as they call it, the Obama phone. And that phone only dials. They have no internet at their house. So if they don't go walk up to places and walk into places, they don't get anything done. And then they got to get there. So luckily, during the pandemic, the bus system and the train system was free. But if it wasn't free, and if you didn't have transportation, you would see these people are even more and more jeopardy. Travel restrictions may impact the survivor's escape or safety plan. It's not safe to use the public transportation on the fly. So if they had made a plan to leave, the COVID hit, now it messed up their whole plan. And how do they get? If you imagine most people have made a safety plan or escape plan, they did it in covert, in secret, that no one would know that it's happening. And then the airline told you, oh, we changed your flight. A flight's been canceled. The idea of them trying to get another flight, it will become almost so impossible because they barely got that flight without the abuser knowing or even finding out. And then as abuser partner may just feel more justified and escalate their tactics during this time because they're being aggravated. They can't go to the bar. They have to be in the house. They got to be around stuck, and they're dealing with the idea of how COVID is affecting them, causing them to become more abusive to their partners. And that's those are things that we not maybe we thinking about or not thinking about, because normally abusers are not at home a lot of times, and now they would been stuck to have to be in the house. And that was the only time when the abuser was not in the house that the family was able to take a breather or do anything. So one of the things that, a few suggestions that for survivors that may have uncertain times, feel better, feel safer, is this thing about being able to suggest to them to create a safety plan. You have to talk to them about creating a safety plan that is personal, make it a practical plan, one that can actually, that can be done. You can't make this unrealistic plan that you won't be able to do. And then, you need to also begin the idea, that whole safety plan in this relationship and planning to leave and what's going to happen after you leave. I tell this story all the time about how a person left their partner, but didn't tell their friend whose house they was going over to not tell the husband that they was coming there. So by the time the husband realized that she was that she was gone and the kids was gone. He called the husband, say, "You see my wife?" He said, "Oh yeah, she's at her house. She just came in." By the time the husband came home and spoke to the wife, she said, "Oh my God, you told him?" That was, by that time he was there, and that turned into a mass murder suicide. The man killed everybody in the house and killed himself outside. And that's a simple thing where the domestic violence centers say, hey, it's safer to go to our kind of place so no one knows, and when you left, you're gone. There is no connection. No one can say where you are, where you're not, because that was one of the severe. So, practice self-care. You people have to take care of themselves. They have to learn how to build into self-care, into what they're doing, and be able to reach out to help, especially, social connections online or over the phone. And as much as possible, make relationships as minute as they may be, that they become daily, that people recognize, or recognize that they don't see you. I know some people have said that they would, when the mailman came every day, they would come out and meet the mailman and say, "Hey, how you doing?" And maybe if you don't see me one day, and these are little simple things that you have to plan and do, and you have to still they have to do them without the partner finding out. Because it's very. I was watching a video recently where some movie, and the partner seen the passports in the drawer, and when he asked about why was they there, that turned into the fight. He ended up actually killing the wife that night, because she wouldn't answer why the passports was there. So it's, I mean, I know in movies sometimes over dramatize things, but these things do really, really happen, and I think we sometimes don't see it to that extent. Oh, secret hand signals, yeah, that's good too. All right, so let's look at what some of the signs look like. Let's look at what some of the signs to recognize. Some of the signs to recognize in our own relationships, because a lot of times it's our own relationships that will tell us where we are. Are we frequently criticized? And sometimes criticism is not, how we think it, but where do we know that, if you're not a good cook and the partner jokes about you not being a good cook, is one thing, but it becomes more severe when it's humiliation in front of everybody in Thanksgiving and say, you don't ever want to eat any of that because I'm almost dying over here eating it every day. That is not something, it seems like a joke, but that is strong humiliation on that partner. Making threats. Threats come in really two different ways. Threats of I'm going to do, and some of the things that people are going to do is not I'm going to do something to you. Sometimes I'm going to do something to me. So that's the opposite. That's the same threat, but it's not a threat to you. It's a threat that I'm going to do, ultimately meaning an indirect, I'm going to do something to you. Being possessive and jealous. Isolation from friends and family, constantly checking up, monitoring, limited access to resource, threats of suicide, and sexual coercion. Sexual coercion is an important one that people don't even think about. When they think of sexual coercion, they always think about the part of someone making someone have sex with them because they're involved in a relationship. They never think of the other end of it, someone refusing sex from their partner in a relationship. If your partner is your partner, if you refuse them sex that you're supposed to be having in this relationship until they do what you want them to do, it's the same thing if you was forcing them to have sex for what you want them to do, to prove something. So sometimes we don't think of that in that context. Some of the red flags for others, you see that they may have frequent injuries, they miss work or school, They have fear of a partner. They neglect the child care. They're very submissive in their behavior, emotional outbursts, insignificant resources, and that they are most of the time very isolated from everybody and everything. So, where does some of this come from? We know that it comes from the social influences of the roles of, normalization of violence, oppression, gender roles, power, beliefs, negative media. All those things play a role in where this is structured into it. And a lot of times I show this video, a video called, two videos actually, The Mask We Wear and Misrepresentation. These talk about how kids receive social fluence images to make them develop the gender roles that they take on. And I show that so people can really understand that when we were talking about that learned behavior, you imagine the learned behavior that you got in the home, and then when you come into the society is many times reinforcing a lot of those same social destructive behaviors to you to say that they're okay in the society. So what happens when you get in a relationship? You practice them as they're okay. One of the questions is why do victims stay? One of the number one reasons that I said before was fear and safety. Children are second, well, not second, but children come next. Another thing is legal barriers. There is sometimes not a legal means to be able to get out of some of these relationships safely and sound. Financially dependent. Love is a large, that's why it's in red, because most of the time people are in relationships. They got a relationship for attraction that they had with this person. Very few abusers walk up to the person and punch them in the stomach and say, oh, we're in love, we're together now. That doesn't happen. There is a coding that happens that this person begins to really love this person. That's one of the issues they have with trying to leave outside of just the violence, that they have some emotional connection to this person and they don't know how to get out of. Social pressures is there, family influences, being isolated, religious and cultural beliefs. They're not allowed to get married. You're supposed to allow your husband to discipline you. You're supposed to allow any male in the family to discipline you when you don't do what you're supposed to do. Lack of resources. One of the big things we see in younger people, fear of parent response. The parents told them that this might not have been a good person for them, but they're going to prove the parent wrong by making this relationship work out, even though it's not working out. And then also, again, we're talking about the idea of blackmail. Blackmail is a big component of that. All right, so we talked about why the victims and survivors stay, but why do the abusers abuse? And it goes right back into the social influence, because they can. There's nothing telling them that they can't practice this abuse. They also, it works a lot of times. It's not like something that, this is outside the normal. This is the learned behavior that they learned, even in irrational thoughts that they have are sometimes accepted because a society socially sometimes reinforces the same behavior to be okay. Yeah. Get your wife in line, man. What's wrong with you? Huh? And that's I say this, and I was telling my class, and we were doing this week's session was sex, gender, and sexuality. And I said that our society is so influenced and always having reinforcement of sex. And this is the same example. That sign, and I'm sure many of you have seen it, the AC company, your wife is hot. That is a suggestion, a social suggestion that becomes a construction in your mind, even though they're talking about AC, but everybody looks at it and remembers and thinks of it in that context. And this is the same way the abusers are able to do and survive and not be held accountable for some of the things that they're doing, because the society sometimes reinforces it. That, it's just, he's just a hothead, he's just drunk, we'll work it out. This is not caused by drugs and alcohol. And remember, it's not caused by anger. What can we do? What can we do? This is an important factor. As clinicians, we may come in contact with people who may be experienced or may have had some type of domestic violence, or they may even come to talk to you about the domestic violence. And they may not, one of the things that we have to do, we have to figure out how we're going to address that. And it's not as simple as us to just be able to just ask a question. Sometimes you don't know the client, you may not know the person well enough to do this direct ask. Is something happening to you or something like that? So sometimes on our paperwork, we might just put, do you feel safe in your home? Are you have you ever felt in danger? And what happens is that then normalizes it, that they know that that paper is not exclusive for them. It also normalizes that they know that this can happen to a lot more people, and you're not isolating them because they came in with a black eye. Because now you're asking them, then you ask anybody else, did this happen to them? And so the way we ask, figuring out if we're able to ask direct or indirect, but when we ask, we have to be ready for what is going to be the answer. And how we ask is very important. One of the things that we find when we talk about validating is when this person answers to you and tell you, yes, I've been being beat by my partner, and I don't know what to do and how to do it. The response is not, well, why did you stay? Why are you staying there? That's not the response, because that is a response of not validating what they're saying. The validation is, oh, I can't believe this is happening to you. This shouldn't happen to anybody. This is not what you deserve. This is what not anyone deserves. Is there anything you want to do about this? Because you can't make them do something. They have to want to do it. And this is giving the opportunity to validate what they said to you, have an understanding, and let them know that if they want to, if something that they need for you to do, that you are willing to help and validate that. Not that you're trying to make them do something that they may not want. It might have just took the first time for them to come and let you know, and it be clear. And then the next couple of times they're gonna get to it, because this is not an immediate process. We sometimes on the outside feel like somebody hitting you is an immediate process that you should leave. For the abuse, sometimes this is not an immediate process. This is something that they have to weigh. They have a lot of things to weigh in this whole dynamics of this relationship, as well as for themselves. The one thing we need to do as clinicians also that's important, and I heard this straight from the mouth of the district attorney when she was speaking. Well, she's not district, well, used to be the district attorney down in the court, and she said that if you come in contact and the person is willing to document what they tell you, don't just say, oh, she says she has some domestic violence issues. No, that doesn't help her. That doesn't help him. Document exactly everything they said to you, because your record's already confidential. It can't be used. Somebody can't subpoena them unless you give them and for the client, and they might be helpful for the client at some point, that if they need evidence that they have documented and told somebody about this past abuse, when they need a restraining order, when these things occur, they would be able to ask you, can you please share this to the file to the court so it can be seen? And you would be able to have detailed documentations of the things that happen, because your notes and your documentation is valid. It can be used for those means. And then the last thing is being able to know where to refer people. You have to know where to send them. If you don't know where to refer them and tell them where to go next, that's when you really start having problems. Let me see. Okay, so what are we doing to help? What are we doing to help? Well, I hope that and when we're helping, one of the major things that we need to be doing as therapists, clinicians, is advocating for prevention. Prevention is one of the biggest ways that we can stop this from affecting younger people, affecting people who haven't understood that they have the tendency to even do this. Another part is the statutes. let's start advocating and making sure certain types of certain types of statutes are written to help affect domestic violence and things of that nature. Policies, knowing what policies is, offering and providing the counseling that is needed for people who have experienced the type of domestic violence trauma, knowing how to be able to maybe suggest to them some clear safety planning, and as much as possible, you may have to do some case management. And I know that some of this is all outside of our realm of being a clinician, and we don't plan to see a client and do all of these things. But sometimes we can assist and direct them into the right place to do them, because we sometimes have more resources than they will. They have the resource of being able to get to us, and if we can help them with more resources while they're there, it can be helpful. Some of the solutions is emergency services, education, intervention, primary prevention, and better accountability. I'm going to talk highly. One of the biggest things that I think that we don't have more, we have all these other things, but we really don't have better accountability. And that's one of the few ways that we're able to, make sure that this doesn't become a pattern for some of the abusers to just go from relationship to relationship, when they can start to get some accountability on what they're doing and how they're doing things to people. Those of us who fight the fight every day to save the lives of these women and children cannot do it without the help of others. We need other people. How do I say this? If I stood in front of the courthouse with a sign by myself saying, "Stop domestic violence," after a while, the police might come and get me and take me away because I'm just one crazy person standing. It's a little bit different when 13,000 people out there saying stop domestic violence. Someone has to at some point step up and recognize. Our communities and our societies as a whole must get fully behind this cause, as we have so many others that deserve our attention. And if we all band together, we can make such a difference in the lives of so many. And this is just that so many people have an idea that this doesn't affect them, so it's really not their issue. That's what it really boils down to. It doesn't affect me, it's not my issue, so I'm just gonna kind of let it go. And this is my last video called Months in the Closet. This normally gives a real good summary of everything I talked about today. Really a really great one. So I keep it as older, but it gives a good summary of how I give my presentations. It's for people to really put themselves in the shoes of the victim to understand what they face and how they deal with things on the day-to-day. All right, so I'm going to show you now some resources. The resources for domestic violence in the county. All right, so some useful resources. Number one, 911. If people feel like you or your loved ones are in immediate danger, 911 is the first thing. You have the Florida Domestic Violence Hotline. You have the Florida Child Abuse Hotline. Very important in many cases when you need to, report incidents. The National Domestic Violence Hotline, and then we also have 211, who is also in most communities. They are able to provide you with other resources that can help assist outside of just the domestic violence centers. Sometimes the client may need more things involved, like, where do they need to go get a new Social Security card from? What do they need to do? 211 has all of that information that you can also refer your client to and allow for them to check out. In this area, the local domestic violence centers, Fort Broward County is Women in Distress, better known as WID, and their hotline. In Palm Beach County, pretty much up Middle Palm Beach County, I think closer to West Palm Beach, they have the Harmony House. Then in not Boca, but the other B. Can't think of the right name. Not Boca, but Boynton. Boynton. In Boynton, they have after victims of domestic violence. After I did some work with them in the past. Miami-Dade has advocates for victims, also known as Safe Place. They have one in center of North Miami, and then one down south Piran area, Florida City. And then they also have victim response, the lodge that's really in like West Miami, but almost like Central Miami, close to, I want to say almost 95th and 27th Avenue, something like that in that area. So really kind of where you have the main areas. And then we also, these are the certified domestic violence centers, but there are tons of other in the county of nonprofits that help people in domestic violence services. And I even volunteer for a couple of them, so I know that they do. If you know people who need definitely, if there's people who need services for batterers, there is this person I work for that I do assessments for, and so I always share his information because we don't have, a lot of times I know they have other places. I just work with him, so I share this with people that he does a pretty good job, batter assessments and anger management, parenting education, supervised visits, modernized change, exchanges, low cases, R&R services. And then my program that I run is fatherhood mentorship. So we look to really work with fathers, reestablishing the idea of becoming a father and what those things, and really push the accountability role of what it means to be a father. Right now, we do all our services online. Matter of fact, they're in group right now as we speak, because we have our graduation on Sunday, so people are doing their makeup sessions and what have you. And so, and that will be it. Is there any questions, comments, concerns? Whew, see, I get it right on time.
You did great, Ron. You did great. I really, really appreciate that. And we do have plenty of time for questions. And I'm just going to throw one out there and then hope that my colleagues are going to jump in as well. Ron, what would you say are some of the things that we as MFTs are either most prone to goofing up of us, where do MFTs tend to make the most mistakes around the issue of interpersonal violence and domestic violence?
I think one of the parts that we do is even though that we are trained to work on our biases, right? We sometimes immediately become emotional. Our emotions come out when we realize that a case may have domestic violence in it. And we sometimes, I think that we also just we're ready to be reactionary. And I think that sometimes that if we're not actually seeing both the batterer and the victim, maybe we don't know everything. We don't know the whole system. And sometimes we may suggest to them that, that they should do some things. And that's why sometimes we need to, I think that we should be able to slow down a little and get the information that we need to be able to offer to them the right decision. Because, one of the things I tell some clinicians is the last thing you want to do is, we already know in our work, sometimes people feel like, well, the therapist gave me advice on what to do. I don't give you advice on what to do. And sometimes, and when it comes to a situation, domestic violence or intimate partner violence, I think we need to be very mindful in that as well, as is not to give them advice on what they should do, but be more of what making a decision on what they think will be best for them to do for them at that time. Because if, within that, it can be putting your own self in danger. See, that's the other part that people have kind of just disregarded, is that, you know, God forbid if they go and tell the partner, and the therapist told me I should leave you. And you would say, well, why would they ever tell the partner that? Because the situation that they're in, they may. And the next thing you know, you are having a problem with somebody who think that you're trying to take their wife away from them or take their partner away from them. So that's the one thing I would say that we need, you know, we have to be mindful. I know our emotions may get involved, but we have to really go back to our skills and keep our neutrality at some point of dealing with those clients.
I really appreciate that. I you know, it's interesting how, you know, domestic violence is one of those topics that does tend to, unless you're in an agency where you encounter it a lot, that the everyday clinician might get shocked by, or might get stumped by a disclosure of domestic violence. I think that's even harder for us than a disclosure of child abuse, because we get that pounded into our heads. And then we have the other reverse as well, as my students who want to immediately call the police on the person, and somehow thinks that that's our job as therapists, is to call police and things like that. So it's a trickier line to walk, I think. Would you, am I on the right track?
That is correct. That we have to remember that what our job is, and not be reactionary about what's happening, because we then put as much as possible, as well as we don't put ourselves involved in the client's life when we're in the room with them. Sometimes we throw that out the window because we're like, oh, this person's in danger, they're gonna die, and we immediately abandon what we would do for every other client that we say we wouldn't get involved with, and we immediately get involved when we have to really let them do it at their time and at their space.
Yeah, I can
There
remember
is no, again, the only reporting that you could do is to report that if they told you that their children was there when when they were abused. But then the dilemma of that is they're going to lose their children and be still in that situation.
Right.
So,
you know, Ron, this is Lee Shelson. First of all, I want to thank you for this presentation. It was very enlightening, and you went over a lot of good information. But you talked about, I think I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you talked about therapist bias and how that can enter into the therapy room, or the context of therapy, and what is our role as a therapist? Do we need to bring these biases in? I don't know if I have a question. I guess this is an observation. Or is it our job to help these people harbor up other resources and strengths to get themselves and their families to a better place in their lives? I remember many years ago when the Nova Clinic was not on campus. It was over on another part of town. And we used to, at that time, get a lot of referrals from Broward County to work with abuse, child abuse and stuff in the clinic. And this young couple from one of the island countries came to see us, and the kids had been separated from their home because they had been abused as in the home, the children. And they were rather young kids, probably 5 or 6, I think 2 boys. And we worked separately with the husband and wife, and then the guardian ad litem would bring the kids in at the latter part of the session, and we're working behind the mirror like you do at Nova. And these kids came in, and they saw their parents, and they immediately got very excited, the kids, and said, "Poppy, Poppy, Mommy." And they ran to the kids and they hugged them, their parents, and the parents had tears streaming down their eyes. And I wanted to point out to my team, I said, you know, these are supposed to be monsters who inflict pain upon their kids, and these kids are messed up kids. Well, if we would have turned off the sound, it was a very normal looking family with a lot of love. And we could have gone one of two ways with that case. We could have continued to look at them as a defective, pathological family that had no future, or we could tend to look at them, well, maybe this is just a loving family who's just needs to do things differently. Come to find out through the guardian ad litem that they came from a culture where hitting the child and punishing the child was very normal, was good parenting, but it came to the attention, rightly so, of people in the Broward school system, and they were therefore referred. The case ended up in a good place, but my point is, a lot of times our biases as therapists, and I realize it's a very tricky tightrope that we have to maneuver on, but many times we have to be very careful that our biases can not only limit our flexibility as therapists, but can also put these people in almost an untenable position to ever try to get to a better place in their lives. There's no guarantees that they will, but I think we need to give them that opportunity. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I thought I wanted to share that.
I think Lee, that's exactly the point that, you know, I try to, you know, that we also can't go on what the social construction of some of this is when we're dealing with the families. There is so many unknowns that we don't know, that we need to, we need to investigate more. I mean, not investigate. We just need to be more curious and spend our time to figure out before we make an action to intervene in a case that may change the whole dynamic of the family.
Right.
And then sometimes it will end up being our fault. I mean, again, a lot of times people don't know in domestic violence cases, it becomes the person who intervenes fault for everything that happened. Not the abuser, not the victim, but the outside person.
Ron, I did have one more question. What, if any, information do you have on the effectiveness of batterer treatment? Do we have effective treatments available? I know that in Florida, for any agency that is a certified DV center, they are not permitted to do therapy between the batterer and the survivor. And so as MFTs, do we just let couples, we just don't do couples therapy, or are there times when it would make sense to do couples therapy to help the couple? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think that continues to be one of the and I have really, ever since I was at Women in Distress, I have really investigated the idea of being a systems therapist and saying that I'm only going to work with the victim. That really conflicted, my idea of being a systems therapist, because I realized in this whole story, the victim is not even getting the full closure because the person who did what they did to them don't even acknowledge that they did anything wrong. So they're still taking on the credit of everything that happened to them is because of them. They don't, there's not opportunity to say, yeah, I did these things too because this is all I knew how to do, and I thought this was what was supposed to be done in a relationship. They never hear that. What they just know is that this relationship, that person was abusive to them, and it's their fault that they allowed that person to be abusive. You don't see that really being a successful model, or a successful way to resolve someone's trauma, or hopefully to see them moving on. But because the state of Florida, the coalition does not allow at any point to be involved with anybody. And also this is a big failure in some sense, because if you have a calculating abuser, if they get to the domestic violence center first, the first person who get there is the person who gets service. The other person is classified as the abuser.
Wow.
So in same-sex relationships, you see that a lot. The first person that get there is the person who's allowed to, and the other person is considered the abuser. A lot, I've seen that many times there. It's not too often that they let the guys come there and say they've been abused. Not really that often. It would have to really be in many cases of them having that power and control, not being abused, but not having their paperwork, being illegal documentation that they take on. But in many cases, that's not the case. But I do feel, and I think it is. I think there would be a whole area of training around how to de-escalate those type of sessions. But I think those type of sessions will be very useful. And I think that they're not sessions that a person should do alone either. That's another. I think that, I would say BTI, co-therapy, and BTI is a great place to do a project at that capacity, because that you have multiple therapists behind the mirror to be able to see. You have two therapists equaling both the male and female in the room, being able to be able to discuss both from their perception. Like it's almost like having two attorneys, but you're having two therapists and they're discussing some of the issues. And because the therapists are working together, they are using some strategic strategies to that maybe they don't realize. But I'm on your side I'm with you, father, I'm with you, the man, and I'm with you, the woman. But their overall goal is to be able to enlighten for both of them and identify. And it's some joining that have to go in. Look, I already thought of a brand new research project.
Haven't even finished that first one, right?
So
the other thing I'm thinking, Ron, is that certainly one of the reasons provided for not doing conjoint therapy with the batterer and the survivor is the risk to the survivor after the therapy. And I was just thinking that now that everything is moved, at least here we are talking in end of September of 2020, and everything is on telemental health. The woman and the two partners could, from different locations, begin doing this kind of therapy, because they would not be in the same location and not live in the same house, and whoever might be at risk, their location could hopefully continue to stay confidential. And so that work could be done in this telemental health environment that would be considered too dangerous to do in person. So this is another possible benefit of COVID, of moving everything to telemental health. But
Dr. Schooley, you hit it right on the head. I see some of the fathers and their partners in this, and it's useful because they are in some argumentative relationships, and they're in relationships where they don't want to listen to each other. And the greatest part about this is when you control the button
mute.
As they continue to talk, you say, no, you're not going to talk, and they continue to talk, you just cut it off, because they can still hear the other partner speak. But again, this all comes from, and my feeling is you have to really join with the people You have to become so enjoying with them that you can do that to them and they accept it as a part of what you're doing.
Right.
I wouldn't suggest people just to say, well, you're gonna come, we're gonna talk, or you want to talk, cut you off. They both know, I think many of them, they know is, and this is a tricky part in this situation, is that being that the fathers are in the program, a lot of times the women think that we have already talked about their situation. And the way I've made sure that didn't happen is because I don't set up the appointment. They have to go to the case manager. The case manager tells them, oh, you need to make appointment with the program coordinator. And then they come to me as the therapist. I don't know why they're coming. I don't know what they're coming for. I see them blindly. And I make sure I let both people know that I'm here for this. And I don't talk to listen, I'm not talking to you about any of this outside of this setting, and that those are things that you have to be the strong boundaries. And when you look at that, even in that same case of working with a couple in domestic violence, that would be the same thing, because what we have a tendency to do is we talk to one of the people outside of each other, the group outside of the couple. And that sometimes causes some of the problem.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. One last question, and then I'm going to wrap this up. Do you know offhand, Ron, any sort of book or writings that would be useful, concrete ideas if an MFT wanted to do couples work where there has been IPV, that you think is particularly useful, that really maybe applies our MFT models to this particular environment from a clinical point of view?
Honestly, I have not. Most of what I have done is went on different states and different domestic violence centers and went through their trainings that they had. So they have like trainings, and not so much trainings, but they talk about how you should operate with couples who are involved in domestic violence.
Okay.
And so I've spent time to look at that because for me that's a much more easier process. And they are, I'm still more interested in people who are practically doing the work. I'm more interested in, I know people write books and they write from what they experience, but I like to see it and know that this is how it worked. So a lot of the stuff I look at is real life practical work that has happened.
Okay.
So,
great. Thanks.
and I wish I knew some of the websites off the top of my head, but I don't.
Well, if you do find them, we'll be happy to do that. Yeah, Lee is saying Yvonne Dolan is one of the ones that does that kind of work, and I do know that there's a fair amount of narrative family therapy websites and practitioners who do this kind of work as well. Well, so as we wrap up, let me remind anyone still listening that if you need continuing education units for this, look down below, or if you're on the live recording right now, look in chat for either the link to sign up for the course so you can pay for your CEUs and get your certificate, or there is Larry Barlow's email address, and that's towards the top of the chat. And again, I'll put that available when this is on YouTube. While you're at it, if you're not currently a member of AAMFT, join. If you're going to be an AAMFT member, you might as well join the Florida Interest Network if you're in Florida. We do have the Florida Interest Network AAMFT Facebook site for those of you on Facebook, and we'll be advertising additional workshops. We'll be having one for the next couple of months, and once they are done, we will post them to YouTube so that you can use those workshops for your initial license or for your license renewal. I want to thank Ron once again. Thank you, sir, for coming and sharing your knowledge. And everyone, have a pleasant evening.
Thank you, Dr. Scully. So for those that we already paid for the CEs, we'll get